The March 28th Question of Ethics conversation, hosted by Courtney Whiteside and moderated by Kevin Bowling, was attended by Creadell Webb, Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for the 1st Judicial District Court in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Stacy Werby, State Jury Coordinator for the Alaska Court System in Anchorage, and Erica Schmidt, Supervisor for the Multnomah Circuit Court in Portland, Oregon. Let's join Courtney as she introduces this Question of Ethics conversation.
We are here on March 28th with the Ethics Subcommittee, and we are going to take on a question of ethics and AI, and we have Kevin Bowling, who is going to lead us in our discussion. Kevin, take it away.
All right, thanks, Courtney. I appreciate all of your efforts to get us to this point. And as you can see, I started off with when I was thinking about this agenda, I was thinking about how did we get here? So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about some of the work of the Joint Technology Committee that has pushed the AI discussion throughout NACM down the road, a little bit about the guide development that we're working on within NACM right now, as well as some podcasts that have some great resources. And then we'll get into the ethical considerations when we talk a little bit about generative AI. And hopefully we'll be able to end up with more of a group discussion and to see what other thoughts you might have about ethical considerations. So that's where we're headed. With the Joint Technology Committee, I think many of you are aware of the fact that we get involved and work on a lot of different topics. And in progress right now, artificial intelligence is sort of at the top of our list. But there are a lot of other things that also overlap with artificial intelligence that we're in the middle of, like cybersecurity and data quality. And we're looking at moving into data visualization and digital records retention, which can be done very effectively with AI and a variety of other things. And with this Joint Technology Committee, for people that may not be familiar with it, it's been around over 30 years. It's a small committee. There's 15 members, some representing COSCA, the Conference of State Court Administrators, some representing the National Center for State Courts, and some representing NACM. And then we also have an ex officio member that represents the IGIS community, or the court vendors community. So we have 15 members, and we do a lot of work on our own and a lot of work through work groups where we bring in subject matter experts on a variety of things. And last year at the annual conference, during one of the board meetings, I was able to talk with the board about JTC and what we were doing. And during that time, we were asked if we would work with NACM on developing a guide on artificial intelligence specifically for courts. What were some of the things that we had to deal with, and what should we be thinking about? And as I go through some of these slides, one of the things I want to do is give a specific shout out or recognition to Roger Rand, who's one of our NACM board members, but also an active member of JTC. He developed a number of these base slides that I'm using, and there are some that were also developed by Casey Kennedy, who's the CIO for the courts in Texas. Casey is also a member of our Joint Technology Committee and represents CTOC, the Court Information Technology Officers Consortium, which is a mouthful to remember and to get out. But Casey and Roger put some of this material together, and then I also relied on another expert that I'll introduce you to a little bit farther down the road. When we talk about this AI guide, and I promise this will eventually get us to ethical considerations, the sort of working outline that we have for this guide currently is developing an introduction to really lay out to court managers across the country, why is AI important? Why should we be taking time to talk about it, to think about it, to study it? We're going to look at some very practical uses in the courts. in what we think of as case studies, if you will, or use cases. And this is what distinguishes us from some of the work that is going on with the Conference of State Court Administrators right now. They are, at the same time we're working on this guide, they are working on a policy paper, which is going to be much shorter, maybe 14, 15 pages, but it's looking more at statewide administrative office of the court perspectives on what kind of policies do courts need to be thinking about in terms of big picture issues right now. And I know that ethical considerations are going to come out in that, as they will as we drill down in this NACM guide and look more specifically at operational aspects of courts. So we'll go through and define AI. We'll talk about existing implementations, because there are some courts that are already using it. Many are using it and don't even realize it's AI that they're using because it's baked into some other software that they have. We'll also look at policy and data governance issues, as well as transparency and public confidence in the courts. And these are areas where ethical considerations become very important. So when we go through and work on a guide like this, it's not something that just one person is involved in. I included a list here just to identify some of the contributors that are working on it. Many of them are NACM members, and I wanted to give a special shout out on this call to our fearless leader, Courtney, who chairs this subcommittee. She's also taking a crack at developing a portion of the paper that looks at ethical considerations, things that we need to be thinking about. And because it was fun to think about giving everyone on this committee a little bit of a hard time, I also included our Peter Kiefer, who we were talking about a little bit earlier. If you haven't had a chance to look at some of the podcasts Peter's developed, there are some episodes from earlier this year in January and February where we talked specifically about AI in the courts, what's good about it, what's bad about it, what does it look like, how do we define it, what are some of the ethical considerations. So there's some good resources for NACM members there. And I'd encourage anyone where you've got a little bit of time on your hands just to click on those podcasts and take a look at them. I think they're worthwhile. Let's talk about ethics and AI. Big question that I started with before in terms of where would we go from here. And when I started scratching my head about this at first, after Courtney, fearlessly twisted my arm on the last call and said, Kevin, you've got to do something on this. I thought, okay, is there an easy way to do something on this? So I went to, I was going to go to ChatGPT first, but I had Copilot up at the time. And I'm sure you're familiar with these, but this is part of what we call generative AI. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So I just took a minute and said to Copilot, outline a 20-minute talk on AI and ethics in the US courts. It took its 15 seconds. I timed it. And boom, I had an outline in front of me, including how I was going to break down my usage of time, which I've already violated. So don't worry about the time parts. But I was a little bit surprised by how balanced this was. I didn't find any immediate hallucinations in it or stuff that it just made up, but we will talk about that as an ethical concern. So I'm going to kind of walk through this outline using some materials that JTC has already developed and a few things that I've put together on looking at AI in the legal system, some specific ethical considerations, which I included bias and fairness, as well as transparency and accountability, because these are all issues that seem to be coming up in some of recent conversations or applications. It even came up in some interim guidance that came out of the National Center for State Courts If you're not familiar with what they have put together an AI rapid response team that is made up of a number of court administrators and national center staff. And one of the things they developed in some talking points on AI in the courts is that a discussion of ethical guidelines, where they said updated guidelines may be needed to make sure generative AI is used ethically by lawyers, litigants, and the courts. So we'll touch on a few areas of where that could come up. We'll talk a little bit about legal obligations and competence and why that's important. A couple of interesting case studies where we'll get into some of those hallucinations. And then just wrapping it up with how do we balance this issue of the efficiency that AI can give us in the courts, as well as the ethical obligations that we all have as court professionals. Some of you may have already immersed yourself to some degree in AI, but if you're talking with staff or with others that may not be familiar with AI, it's important right out of the gate to make sure that everybody has some similar foundation or footing about AI, because as I talk with folks, a lot of people think AI is one thing. It's artificial intelligence. And I really don't have any clue that that's a broad, sweeping category, and there are several things that are under that umbrella. And then we'll talk a little bit about some benefits as well. But if you think about the AI umbrella, there's lots of different things like machine learning. There could be robots involved or chatbots that I'm sure many of you have heard about and maybe use on your own websites. There's natural language processing, which can come down to some very helpful things, applications for courts when you think about translators or interpreters or machines that can talk with somebody at your counter if they don't speak English and provide instant translations for your staff or in the courtroom. And then there's, along the list, there's this generative AI, which really is important to understand, because the first few areas of artificial intelligence basically does what a human tells it to do. We build the guardrails, we give it its specs, we give it its marching orders, but it doesn't think on its own. Generative AI is a different kind of artificial intelligence that learns as it goes. It absorbs information, whether it's large bodies, large language models, or the internet, or any number of things, but it can get to the point where it can start doing things on its own. And that's why if you look over to the side of the slide, you may hear some folks talk about the loop and the fact that AI management, when we're getting into the details here, we're going to be talking about, is there a person in the loop? Are they on the loop, or are they out of the loop? And what that simply means is that if you're in the loop, AI isn't going to do anything without the human telling it to do it. It can't function on its own. It can't make its own decisions or come to its own conclusions. It's constantly going to be seeking that direction from a human. When a human is on the loop, that means there could be some give and take. It may mean that the human's going to give the AI a certain amount of discretion and say, I want you to go and do X, Y, and Z within these parameters, and then come back and tell me about where you are, and we'll see what we're going to do next. When a human's completely out of the loop, it's a whole different ballgame. Now you're into full-blown generative AI. It's thinking for itself. It's developing pathways it's going to take. So that's just to help us get to the point of having some similar foundation. This slide just focuses on the fact how generative AI works and where it takes information from. We're not just talking about text. We're not only talking in the court world about forms or court rules or administrative orders or case decisions, but data comes in all kinds of forms. It could be this video that we're talking about. It could be pictures. It could be audio. In the computer world, everything comes down to zeros and ones. It's all data. And generative AI can be programmed to pick up on any form of data and then learn from that and generate new information based on that. And this next slide, just to give you some quick examples of applications today, the companies are coming and going every day. So these specific examples might be a little out of date, but I wanted to give you an idea of the kinds of text generation software that's out there. There's code generation where programmers can plug an idea or a piece of code into GitHub, a Copilot, or one of these other softwares, and it will write the software for you. So there's also Gen AI for images, and that's something that has been a real concern. So I could take, one of my kids', 5th grade drawings of the family and say, ask Dolly to take this and do it in the form of a Picasso, and I'll have a Picasso come back in a moment. So, from a standpoint of artists, there's a lot of concerns about forgeries, as there are with other generative AIs where voice actors or musicians are involved, and a lot of things can be copied. I heard recently in one presentation that some of this generative AI now only needs 3 seconds of hearing your voice, and then it can generate anything you want to say and have it sound like it's coming out of your mouth.
Kevin, can I hop in here?
Sure, go right ahead.
So I don't know if I'm excited or terrified. Like on one hand, I think it's really, really like, how amazing is this that that this is on the horizon and this is being created. But then I also think I saw Terminator movies. I saw war games. So this is, so it's equally also terrifying. But then I think I also saw the Jetsons and was a fan. So, I don't know if I should be super excited or just absolutely terrified, but I know 100% that I'm absolutely overwhelmed and flummoxed by the amount of uses and all of the directions that it seems to be going simultaneously, and how much oversight and control there is not.
Right. And Courtney, you raise a great point. Not too long ago, some of you might have seen this on some of the national news programs, but there were, I don't know, something like 50 of the leading generative AI gurus from around the world, people that actually created a lot of this stuff and put together an open letter that I think got published in the New York Times, basically saying this could be an existential crisis. And that really what we need to be talking about, anybody that's using it, is about putting the appropriate guardrails in place. And that's part of what I think is going to fall on this ethics subcommittee, is to be thinking about what kind of guardrails need to be in place for court managers in terms of how we use this technology going forward. So I think there is some room to be terrified. But I also think we can't stick our heads in the sand, because there are just too many benefits of AI. As I mentioned, when I wanted an outline to put together for you today, Copilot came up with it in 15 seconds. Didn't take long. And I'm not paying it by the hour. So
Yeah.
that's,
Well, I wish I
that-
would have thought about that in using my paper. It
Yeah,
didn't, like, even when I was writing a paper about AI, I didn't even cross my mind to use AI. So,
yeah.
I don't know what that says about me, but,
Well, it's one of those things we'll talk about next steps when we get towards the end today. That's something that we as court managers can do, is just try using it in little bits and pieces and get to the point where we have some comfort level with it. But it's great at creating ideas. It's great for resources. If you might have some light staffing in some areas and you needed some help, and it can interact on a variety of platforms. So there are lots of things that are good about it, but I think where we have to be very careful, and which I think a focus of this subcommittee will be, is what are those ethical considerations? What are some things we need to be concerned about? And obviously in the court world, bias and fairness are big issues. And we have to be careful about addressing those or understanding how they might be addressed in AI algorithms and their impact on judicial decisions. I'm going to give you an example of something that came up a few years ago with a project I was working on with DOJ, and it had to do with facial recognition. Facial recognition has come up as a hot button issue in a lot of jurisdictions. And I learned from Roger not long ago that in Oregon, there are some judges that use facial recognition on their computers so they don't have to worry about remembering passwords. They just put their face in front of their computer, it recognizes them, and it opens up all the applications they need to operate in court. Simple thing. And they're not going to forget their face. They're always going to bring that with them. So at the same time, there are a lot of studies that were done where facial recognition has been used by law enforcement in criminal investigations. And what they learned through this process, as it started, identifying potential criminals through facial recognition, is that a lot of the training that was done on Caucasian faces. And all of the recognition and the individual aspects of Caucasian faces can be very different from Black or brown or Asian or Native American faces. And there were a lot of mistakes that were coming up as a result. And people of color were being unfairly identified with a lot of this facial recognition software when it was first being developed. They've come a long way since that happened, but it's still not, in some people's sense, it's still not ready for prime time yet. So that's just one example of where we could have bias or unfairness creep into the courts, depending on how different types of AI is used. Transparency is an issue that I'll give you a specific example of. And I know you've all heard about cases where there now is question about, just so we know what we're dealing with, should we require anybody that files a pleading with the court to also file a statement indicating if they used AI to develop any of the pleadings?
some sort of certification that, no AI
Exactly.
was utilized.
Yeah.
And
then,
I think
just like with everything we do, accountability comes into it, because when something goes wrong, and we know it will, how do you hold somebody accountable? And Courtney, I'm sorry if I stepped on your toes there. Go right ahead.
No, it just seems like they kind of play off each other. So when I'm looking at bias and fairness, the other thing that I thought about is if this is a system that learns by what we put in it, are we at risk of that individual's biases being brought into what the system is learning and thereby spitting out? But also, I mean, the accountability piece is so difficult, because if there isn't that transparency piece, then it makes it really difficult to hold somebody accountable, because there isn't a there isn't something that spits out at the end of the product that says, oh, and this was created by blah blah blah.
Right.
So I think it's really, really interesting. But I think that the bias and fairness, the other thing that I thought of on that section as well is accessibility to those products. I think that the digital divide comes into play at that point. I think the generational issues come into play. So I think it's really interesting, and I know I sound like a negative Nancy about this stuff, but I do think that there is some really neat possibilities out there, but just to not have that actual control. And even if there was a transparency issue, how do you hold that individual accountable? And at the speed that technology, and this in particular, seems to be advancing, it's been my observation that courts don't move that fast when it comes to adapting rules and regulations for oversight. So it's kind of wild. But those are just some of the things that I noticed. But I would be interested if any, am I completely off the mark with the rest of our colleagues here, or are you guys kind of thinking along the same lines?
No, I totally agree. And I threw a link in the chat there about biases, how we feed the AI biases, and then in turn, people who are reading what the AI puts out are absorbing those biases. So we kind of get into a bias spiral there.
Yes.
So that's a huge concern to me, is if the AI is learning from people, then we are definitely giving it biases. And how do we filter for that and, weed that out, if you even can? I mean,
no, I completely agree too. And I think it's not just, I mean, my initial thought is going towards like court filings and stuff like that. Like if an attorney at a fancy law firm can use AI, but the person who's representing themselves can't, there's that. But then also I'm thinking on a personnel level of, do I need to start double checking cover letters to see if one used AI and the other didn't? So it's like,
how would you know?
And how would you know? So it's like, am I giving favoritism to the person who used AI in their cover letter as opposed to somebody who actually wrote it? So
Eric,
you can start making them write
you're,
their cover letter in the interview. Go ahead and write me a cover letter. Write me a little ditty on why you want to work here.
So Erica, you're raising some important policy level issues, because this really does tie in not just to how the public or the legal system is bringing things into the court, but it's also how's this being used or not used by our own employees. And that's a huge issue. And there are a number of challenges. So Courtney, you're not being a negative Nancy, as you say, with this, but there are important concerns that I think as court managers, we have to take into account. Erica, you just raised the cost issue in terms of looking at the haves and the have-nots. Is this something that is going to be universally available at some point? It looks like it's going in that direction, but I think all of us understand that, Silicon Valley is going to try to figure out some way to monetize, access to it. Data is another issue. We've talked about bias a little bit. We've talked about the fact that with generative AI, these large models have basically gone out and sucked up everything on the internet. So if you've got any kind of public facing information, it's already been grabbed. If you've got a website out there that's public facing, that information can be easily grabbed. I think a big issue, ethical issue for courts, is what do we do about our internal data? What about the confidential or sensitive data that we are statutorily responsible for? What do we do with adoption files or with juvenile files or with suppressed criminal matters or things like that? We've got to really think about what kind of guardrails or policies need to be in place for that. We've got to understand reliability as an issue, that if we're in the loop or out of the loop or on the loop, where are we? And do we understand clearly that hallucinations are a real thing? And that sometimes if you ask AI for its input, it's going to give it to you, but it might just be making stuff up. So we have to think about that. And ultimately, if there's concerns about who owns the court data, that's going to have to be a policy issue that's grappled with as well. But it doesn't end here. It gets even better because when we look at who else is in the court system, we've got lawyers and judges. And one of the things that is not always fully understood is that in the Code of Professional Responsibility for lawyers, we are already legally required to be technically competent. And I can tell you that scares me because this technology is moving so fast. How can we really certify that we're technically competent to provide the best representation for our clients as possible if we're not using the most relevant or the most up-to-date information or technology? From the judge's standpoint, they have obligations as well, not only using different kinds of AI tools, but being able to manage them in the courtroom. When you begin to think about digital evidence coming in, how is a judge going to be able to evaluate evidence and know whether it is real or Memorex, if you can remember that old commercial from decades ago? So, from that standpoint, there are different vendors that are out there developing tools right now that judges or others might be able to use where you can spot AI. You can tell if a piece of evidence or a text or a photo has been modified in some way using AI.
If your court system can afford that, because that as well will come at the cost. So I think it's going to present a lot of varying degrees of practice and utilization, even from court to court, in our states that are unified court systems, that are not unified court systems. And I think, the word that I'm thinking was on your previous slide, but not in the frame in which I'm thinking of it. It talks about being human supervised, but I think the thing that makes courts so special is the human aspect of it. And I think AI really removes the humanity, because much like you've talked about, AI only knows potentially what we feed it. It doesn't, it doesn't know right from wrong. It doesn't have, so much of what we do is human interaction. And I think we would really lose that, and the public trust and confidence would continue to suffer, because there is no deviation from this. It's this plus this equals this, always. You don't ever deviate from it. And I think you lose some of the, not only judicial discretion, but also just that human interaction. And maybe I'm more sensitive to it coming from a limited jurisdiction court, of a municipal court, and taking on that what we do in the courts is not unique, but it's the communities that we serve that make it unique, and the culture within the community and the court. So that just presents a real challenge for me, of how do you overcome that loss of human interaction that is so pivotal to the court system.
And that really comes down to where we're going to end on today, and looking at those policy considerations. How are you going to control that, and what do you have to be thinking about? I also, looking at both sides of the coin, I've got a slide on possible uses and possible misuses in the justice system. So this is just a quick thumbnail sketch of some of the things that you can do in terms of predicting case outcomes. You can, AI can be used very effectively to provide better accessibility to self-represented litigants, can provide a lot of information. It can automate legal research. It's used in different kinds of policing or legal training in the community. It doesn't have to replace judges, but it can help provide recommendations for judges on what to do in different cases based on the predictive analytics that come along with it. So there's a lot of different ways. And when we fully develop the AI guide for NACM, one of the things that we're going to be doing is adding in use cases as we learn about success stories in different jurisdictions around the country. And the guide itself is going to be established in a digital format, so we'll be able to regularly update it with new information as it comes out. Now, having said that, there's also a downside. And Courtney, you've touched on several of these things, but we already know that people can create fake exhibits. Lawyers can get lazy in their process and not have a good review process. Our own law clerks might get lazy with their research works. It could end up faking judicial work products, or there are a lot of different things that could be a problem. And you may have noticed some of the cases that have come out. Probably the most well-known one is this Mata versus Avianca. And that was a case where an individual was flying from El Salvador to the US and was bumped. One of the stewardesses ran into his leg with a cart and injured him while he was trying to have a drink on the flight, and came back, landed in New York, and sued Avianca.
Well, that's fair. He messed up his drink. I mean,
yeah, exactly. So by the time he got to that point, he ended up filing a case. A lawyer who had been practicing for over 30 years in New York ended up filing his pleadings, and on one of these motions filed like a half a dozen cases that to support his position. And when the other side started looking at those case sites, realized that they didn't exist. They were all made up. And the lawyer had to fall on his own sword and admit to the court that he used ChatGPT. He didn't check the results. He just assumed that if it was AI, it was all right. And that's why we get to this next part, guardrails that some courts have put in place. Illinois and Texas were two courts that came up. And by the way, these results did come from AI. I used Copilot to find these, but then verified them. But these are examples of orders that have been issued in federal court, saying that if an attorney is going to use AI, or any party is going to use AI, so it applies to self-represented litigants as well, they have to disclose that and make sure the court is aware that they know AI is being used. So I think we're going to see more of that type of thing coming out in policy statements as we begin to understand what guardrails need to be in place. So when we come down to it, and this is going back to Copilot's outline for me, she told me to make sure that I focused on this being a delicate balance, to emphasize that there are benefits, but there are obligations as well. And then she wanted to remind me to make sure I recap the key points and encourage you to keep talking with each other. So I thought you'd find that worth a smile at least.
We'll have to tell her thank you.
Yeah, I will. And I'm assuming it's a her, but maybe it's a he, maybe it's a both and. I'm not sure.
Creadell, I have a question for you as an attorney. If you were defense counsel, would you be fearful that the demand would erode on even, maybe not on larger state cases, right? but maybe on violations of local ordinance, or like, do you feel that the need for defense counsel would erode on lesser cases, if you will? Lesser cases is not the way to put it, but when the range of punishment is less.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I look at it like this. I think that at this point, AI is not going to replace good lawyering, because even on small cases, there's always something different within that case. There's always a different set of circumstances. And what you mentioned earlier was that humanity element. And sometimes human beings can do a better job at explaining a particular situation or outcome. Now, with that being said, I do think that AI, like anything else, is a tool, and it's a tool that eventually I think we'll start to get used to. So let's think about something as simple as copy and paste. We're very used to it. Nobody would think about, the downside of using copy and paste, but guess what? If you have a similar case and you go to an old case and you copy the whole thing because everything's pretty similar, you go Control C, Control V, but then you leave facts in there that don't belong. To me, that's very similar to just using AI and not reviewing it, and it starts to hallucinate. So in my mind, this is sort of a negligent use of artificial intelligence, or if you want to call it something that's sort of it's not responsible. And here's the thing. On the flip side, for every negative thing you think about AI, we can think about something positive. So let's say you start having smaller cases where self-represented litigants say, well, I can figure this out on my own. So kind of, this almost gets at Courtney's question a little bit, but it's like, why do I even need a lawyer if AI can produce these documents? Again, I think there's still a risk, because there are certain things that lawyers may know given a certain set of data. And look, what I'm saying now, my opinion might become outdated within the next 4 or 5 years. Maybe generative AI enhances so much that we can't tell the difference. But I still think that it's evolving. And for right now, you can't solely rely on this, because AI may miss a step that a lawyer knows about because you've worked in the field. And I think that with self-represented litigants, even without AI, they always have an option to use like law libraries and take a risk, right? They can take a risk on their case and they can get it right sometimes, and other times they'll get it wrong. So AI to me is just another tool that may help an individual get it right, or it can really change the trajectory of their case. And so in many cases, it's just going to depend. But I think AI, we've already seen it evolve. I mean, even as of 2 years ago, especially generative AI. I mean, Chat GPT, it was Google Bard at one point. Now it's Google Gemini. We're seeing all these models, and it does scare me, because Kevin mentioned something that at some point we will have the software that can detect whether or not something is AI. Well, what if AI starts discovering, hey, there's software that's looking at me, so I'm going to make myself go undetected? And at some point, are we going to know what's authentic and what's not? How are we going to authenticate evidence? I mean,
Creadell,
I don't know where this is going to go.
Yeah, Creadell, you just gave me a perfect segue to sort of wrap this up. I know we're at the top of the hour, but big question that we all have to deal with is, what do we do right now? And I think just the awareness that we can create among our colleagues, that it exists and there are tools that are out there, that we have to talk about proper governance, and how are we going to put policy in place to effectively use the tools that are available to us. There was a time when none of us used a cell phone, and it scared us when they first came out. But now, it's part of our culture. And I think, Creadell, you were right on target when you're saying it's unfamiliar territory now, but it's going to become, more familiar as we go along, and it's going to continue to change and evolve and improve, hopefully, and give us some strong benefits. And we just have to watch out for those ethical issues that pop up along the way, and continue talking with each other and highlight those. So Courtney, I realize that's sort of a quick run through AI and some of the ethical considerations, but I hope that captures a little bit of what you were looking for from me today.
I think that's great. And I think two things. I think what the courts need to do right now is that we need to patiently wait for the AI guide to come out to tell us what our next steps are and what we need to do. So I think that is a big part of that. So thank you, Kevin, for providing that for us. We are going to stop the recording, and then we are going to verify that it is indeed Norman Meyer on this call and we're not a deep fake.
It's the real me.
Thanks for joining us today. The Question of Ethics Conversation is a regular segment on ethics, courts, and court administration. Today's episode will be available on our website, in the Court Manager Journal, on the Court Leader website, on YouTube, Facebook, iTunes, LinkedIn, and on X, formerly known as Twitter. Become part of the conversation. Join us live when we hold the Question of Ethics Conversation. Episodes are held immediately following the monthly NACM Ethics Subcommittee meeting on the fourth Thursday of the month. Check the NACM Committee webpage for the schedule and Zoom link. If you have questions, comments, or ideas for future conversations, email us. Our address is ethics@nacmnet.org. Did you hear an interesting comment by one of the panelists that you would like to listen to again, but you don't want to search the entire episode to find it? The Additional Resources section on the webpage has a question time marker sheet. Find the discussion question on the sheet, and next to it is the time that question was asked. You can quickly fast forward to that time and listen to the panelists' comments. Remember, if you don't have time to watch an episode, you can always listen to the audio version. Listen in your car or on the bus on your way to or from work. You never have to miss an episode. I'm Pete Kiefer, and on behalf of our guests, the Court Leader website, and the National Association for Court Management, thank you, and have a great day. The views, information, and opinions expressed during this episode are solely those of the hosts and the individual presenters. They do not necessarily represent the position of the National Association for Court Management.